After a 30 years long armed struggle against the military junta, the Derg, Eritrea gained its independence from Ethiopia on May 24, 1993. More than 30 years later, the average Eritrean still lives in shackles. Today, in the 21st century, torture, exploitation, and poverty symbolize daily life in Eritrea, a country now known as one of the most repressive states in the world, nicknamed the North Korea of Africa.
Secrecy and routine violations of human rights have earned the country the nickname of Africa's North Korea. At the time, the 32nd session of the UN Human Rights Council was going to convene on July 1, 2016, to adopt the recommendation of the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in Eritrea that the Eritrean government's behavior constitutes crimes against humanity. Alamsagad Abai, in his latest publication, The Historical Orbit of Eritrea's Agony.
ኤርትራ ናይ ነፃ ምዝራብን መፅሓፍን መሰል ክወሃበካ ብዙሕ ግዜ ተለግይዎ ዝደንገሉ ይመስለካ
ምድላዩ ክዛረብ ደልየ ክዛረብ ክእሊ ሕጂ እውን ኣይተኸልከለን ኣሎ
Well, are you prepared to tolerate any kind of opposition in Eritrea?
What kind of opposition? Agents hired by the CIA from Langley, or opposition from inside, or any kind of opposition?
There was something of a crackdown against the opposition by the Eritreans, by your government in 2001. Journalists were in prison.
Not at all. Not at all. You are disinformed. There has never been any opposition in this country. This is a total lie. And if you're talking about a political process, that is a different matter. If you're talking an opposition that has been fabricated and created by Langley, then you would call that an opposition. I would not call that an opposition.
The history of Eritrean state formation and nation building was very protracted, and it's a unique experience in Africa as well as in the world, because Eritrea was pre-colonial Eritrea was part and parcel of Tigrai, and we can call it today's Ethiopia, but after the coming of Italian, they give the name and the territory for Eritrea. And the Italian colonialism has two major strategies. At the beginning, it was simply to settle the unemployed Italians in the southern part of Italy, so that it was a settler colony. It was not a colony for resource, raw material, or geopolitical reason. Rather, simply Italy took Eritrea with the support of Great Britain. In fact, Great Britain was a supporter to Italy to take Eritrea. It started as a company, the Ravatino company, and after that they started the Wichala Agreement. By the Wichala Agreement, the Italian got Eritrea, and that was the beginning of a new history for Eritrea, apart from its historical root, Tigrai, the beginning of a colonial history. So the Italian policy had two major goals. At the beginning, especially from 1890s up to 1930s, until the coming of the fascist Mussolini, they were simply to settle the unemployed Italians. And they create that map, Eritrea, and they introduce elementary schools and elements of modernization. It was not as such successful in modernizing and industrializing Eritrea as a first phase. But with the coming, as a second phase, with the coming of Benito Mussolini as a leader of Italy, Eritrea got its importance. That Benito Mussolini started to industrialize, modernize, urbanize Eritrea simply for two reasons. The first reason is as a military base for his aggression against Ethiopia. The Eritreans were serving as the soldiers of Italy in their fight against Ethiopia, even Libya and Somalia. And then a kind of modernization was booming, and Asmara was become more modern and named as Piccolo Roma, that means Little Roma, and the railway urbanization of Asmara. This makes the beginning of this separate assumption on the Eritrean side, that they expose it into modernization, and they believe that we are different from the Tigrayans on the other side of the Merab River. We are different from the Ethiopians because we are modernized. We are exposed to the Western civilization. Later it becomes, eating spaghetti and this even macchiato. This all makes that the Eritreans are more modern than their Tigrayan counterparts, as well as the Ethiopians. But the outcome of Italian colonization, it was not successful in identity formation, a concrete, united Eritrean identity formation. Rather, it gives the name as well as the map. Eritrea, the Italian colonial policy on Eritrea was Russia's colonial policy. Even the Eritreans themselves were not entitled to be in Asmara.
ኢሳያስ ግን ቃል በቃል ንሕና ንጣልያን ኮሎኒያል ፓወር ዝገበርና ንሕና ኢና ብሓንጎልና ብጉልበትና ብኽእለትና ብሏል። ልዩ መሆናቸውን ለመግለጽ የሞከረው እኛ እኮ ጣሊያንን ሳይቀር ቀኝ ገዢ ያደረግነን በራሳችን ላይ ቀኝ ገዢ የሾምን አይነት ነገር ይሄ እንዴት ነው የሚብራራው ነው?
ኦኬ፣ ይሄ ምን መሰለህ፣ ጣሊያኑ ይበዛ ነበር በአስመራ ውስጥ ከሀበሻው በላይ እና አሁን እንደዛ ከሆነ ደግሞ እሱ ብቻ ሳይሆን አፓርታይድ ሲስተም ነው የነበረው። አፓርታይድ ሲስተም ያ ቤላ አዝማራ ብሎ አሁን የሚሞኩባት እንትን ያ ሴንተር ኦፍ አዝማራ አሁን ዩኔስኮ ሄሪቴጅ አርገዋት ያሉትን እዛ ላይ ሀበሻ አይገባም ነበር። ሀበሻው የሚኖረው ጊቶስ ላይ አካባቢ ከአስመራ አካባቢ ያሉትን ለምሳሌ አባሻውል፣ ገዛ ብርሃኑ፣ ዳጋ አድቤ ምናምን የሚባሉትን ጊቶስ እዛ ላይ ነው ይኖር የነበረው እና አባቶች ሲል በዛን ጊዜ የነበሩ ሀበሾች አስመራ the ultimate symbol of oppression ናት ለነሱ። ምክንያቱም በዛን ጊዜ አስመራ እነሱን ኢሳያስ የሚለው ሳይሆን ሚኒያል ጆብስ ያደረጉ የሚያሰሯቸው የነበሩት።
The Italians intentionally they try to promote the Muslims and the lowland minorities so that to counterbalance the Christians and the Tigrinya speakers. So there was successful in making parity. That's why the Muslims and the minorities were supporting Italian to remain even. The Italian was successful in they tried to promote that the Eritreans are different, especially in the fascist narratives that the Tigrayans and the Ethiopians are backward, uncivilized, working as a laborers, simply to create a different identity, a fascist identity against. And they were also privileged. They were privileged as administrators in the fascist time. As we know it, the name of Eritrea before Italy was Bahra Nagash, Marab Milash. It's simply to differentiate the Eritreans created by Italy from the Tigrinya speakers on the southern of the Merab River. Simply they call it Marab Milash, or Eritrea was Bahra Nagash and Tigray was Midra Nagash. That means the political center was in Tigray, and Eritrea was an outlet and the port of the Tigrayan kingdom.
After 60 years of colonization, Italy's defeat in World War II would lead to the end of its control of Eritrea. For 10 more years, Eritrea would remain a colony occupied by the British. Later, the United Nations would recommend that Eritrea be federated with Ethiopia. The federal system would give Eritrea semi-autonomy. The state would have its own constitution, the right to elect its leaders and use local languages in governance and schooling. Soon after, the emperor would decide. This arrangement was intolerable.
After the defeat of Italy by Britain, the Eritreans had no united political organization, united political standing on what should be the fate of Eritrea. There is one saying, the Italian policy was fill your stomach and shut up. There is no political enlightenment, political party, and this all freedom of expression. That's why there was no organized political entity. Immediately after the defeat of Italy, there was a political organization that was struggling against colonialism. Takaste Nagash stated that the Eritrean nationalism was not like the African nationalism, because in Africa people were struggling against colonialism, but the Eritreans, they accepted Italian colonialism. So it's partly African because it was created by colonialism, but it was not partly African because they were not struggling against Italian colonialism. Rather, they accepted it, they prized it, and even sometimes they use as simply as a pride that we are members of the Western community, members of this Roma identity. When the British came, the Eritreans were not organized, they were not politically united to define their destinies. So after 4 years, 1944, the British administrator of the time, military administrator, Brigadier General Stephen Longrig, he tries to allow this freedom of expression, political mobilizations. As a result, four political parties began to emerge. During the British period, the British characterized Eritrean politics as highland, lowland, Muslim, Christian. So the United Nations at the beginning organized commission of four powers. Then the United Nations also organizes a second commission. That commission was a commission of 5 states. And the purpose of the commission was similar. What the Eritrean people are interested? What is the interest of the Eritrean people? So the United Nations partly recognized Eritrea is different. The United Nations failed to immediately recognize Eritrea should be decolonized. So independent states could be the solution. But rather simply it has to be federated with Ethiopia. Partly recognized Eritrea's autonomy. Not only that, Arab and Tigrinya was recognized as official language of Eritrea, and the Muslims and the Christians were equally recognized. And the United Nations offered Eritrea the first democratic constitution on Africa. So the federation finally was collapsed. After 10 years, the federation also ended up with a failure. In 1958, Haile Selassie began to dismantle all the flag, the political organization, the trade union, as well as the National Assembly and leaders of. Progressively, he dissolved the national symbols in Eritrea during the federation. So the Eritreans began to think that Ethiopia is encroaching into the federation, so that we have to start a movement. At the beginning, at first they established Eritrean Liberation Movement. It was a movement to defend the federation. It was called also Mahabar Shawate, members of 7, the leaders of 7, and it was a Mahabar Shawate simply to defend the federation from totally disintegrating. But Haile Selassie in 1962 totally dissolved the federation. But in 1961, the lowlanders, the Eritrean lowlanders, they start the armed struggle because Ethiopia is encroaching into Eritrea, because Eritrea is a Christian in monarchy, so that it is better to start the armed struggle. This armed struggle was politically supported by Wolde Mariam and the other Muslim groups, but the first armed resistance was led by Idris Awate. He was leading members of the Eritrean armed force trained in Sudan. So in 1961, September 1, 1961, the Eritreans began the 13 years armed struggle.
Eritreans, in an effort to reclaim their government and future, would soon start to form political parties that took on an armed resistance against the Ethiopian government.
ቃልሲ ህዝቢ ኤርትራ ክግለጽ እንደሆነ ኮይኑ ኩሉ ግዜ ኣብ ውሽጡ ዝነበረ ዘይምርድዳእን ሓድሕዳዊ ምቅትታልን ክርስዕ ኣለዎ ማለት ኣይኮነን ከም ሓደ ክፋል ናይቲ ታሪክ ክዝከር ኣለዎ።
Jabha ALF faced a problem of factionalism. Opposition from different political groups and the zonal leaders. In general, when we put the policy of Jabha, its policy was clear. Its nationalism was based on colonial thesis. Eritrea was created by colonialism. And its policy was armed struggle to establish an Islamic state of Eritrea supported by the Arab countries on the Red Sea. They use different instruments, this concept called falul, anarchist, to undermine the oppositions and question of reform within the political party. After that, there is political rift within Jabha, and in 1971, I think Jabha was fragmented into two. There is Eritrean Liberation Front / Popular Liberation Front, that was 1 and 2, where Isaias Afwerki was emerged. Taking the culture as well as the long history of colonial and external powers administration on Eritrea. The Eritreans are not, even today, they are not in a position to claim that we have this democratic political culture. So Isaias was, APLF relatively, it was considered, it was inclusive because territorial nationalist, not Christian political party, or in fact it was not neither Christian nor Muslim, rather it was a Maoist, Marxist-Leninist. In fact, Isaias Afwerki, APLF was an umbrella organization, the Eritrean People's Liberation Force, but within APLF there was also a secret political organization that was Eritrean People's Revolutionary Party. That party was Isaias Afwerki's party. That means a party within an organization. The organization was APLF, but the party within APLF. That means Isaias Afwerki is using that secret party as a means to control APLF and other fighters, so that it was a secret party that was dissolved even immediately before 1991. So it was not as such democratic. We can simply, it was democratic because it was a guerrilla, because most of the members of APLF considered that we were democratic. We were mobilized simply to achieve an independent state of Eritrea from Ethiopian colonialism. That was the mobilizing factor, that we can consider that it was relatively democratic than the post 2000.
عن شعاتن زوردهم درقي من قد عصيوهم كم زنبره حزباو ግንባር بوسانه አቶ ኢሳያስ ንሪኦ ነገራት ስለዚህ ታይቲ ውልቃዊ ስምዒት ናይ ኢሳያስ እዩ ካብ ሜዳ ትሒዙ ስጋዕ ዛዛ ለማዓንቲ ዝገዝእ ዘሎ
መገዲ ረኺብና ኢልና ኤርትራ ክንወፅኦ ሻዕብያ ምሕላፍ ከሊልና ኣብ ደገ ሱዳን ንክስበፅሑ ኣብ ደገ ከሳ መገዲ 4 ሰዓት ጥራይ ምስ ተረፎ ኣጊተሩ
In May of 1991, Eritrean People's Liberation Front marched into Asmara, Eritrea's capital, ending 30 years of struggle for independence. 2 years later, Eritreans would hold a referendum to officially declare their independence and gain international recognition as a sovereign state.
كدمي أستاذ حرور حبيلو أذكر مع عالم ريفرندم أكايدكم دليتكم تاي مخانو ترى ترسف نتدانيرو دليتكم تاي مخانو الرقاقيتكم له دليتكم نتعنت مخانو درقا مولو دمتخ بحال ذكال من قد قليتكم عالم سميعكم عالم تقبلكم دليتكم سميركم مقعد دليتكم مسمركم نتتحالف يرسعون من تغنم مهارلو نقصنا نذكرهم من تغنم مهارلو بنا ينحكون بنا ينسراسرون إذا حلف حليف الله حدش معراف نجمر إذا حدش معراف ذي أبين تمرب حصرنا حضر اللي يكون إذا حدش معراف ذي حدب لعلي حدب تحت الأمامة اللي يكون إذا حدش معراف ذي نغني معرة تطول حضرات أمونغو هزو تازلو حضرات أفريسنا دقاتنا فتر وخصلي انتين مهرمبر نمحخ زي نذكره كفون يزول أمناتنا.
During the armed struggle, in fact, PLF was instrumental in protecting Eritrea's armed struggle from annihilation by the Derg regime during the Red Star campaign. Had the PLF failed to support PLF in that time, we could have a different scenario. The same is true in 1991. You know, the PLF government was ready to accept the de facto state of Eritrea during the 1991 Addis Ababa Transitional Conference. They recognized that Eritrea's destiny will be determined by referendum, and that referendum will be recognized, supervised by international community. And there were two options. Do you approve Eritrea to be a sovereign and independent state? Yes or no? So they designed this national charter, and the national charter policy was they visioned that by 2050, 15, Eritrea will be Singapore in urbanization, Germany in infrastructure, Sweden in social justice, and Israel in military power. There is no problem with the ambition, but the problem was that, so if Eritrea is envisioning this goal, so where the resource should come from? They stated that our cheap labor, raw material will be from Sudan and Ethiopia. Isaias Afwerki intentionally followed that nation building from above, and the slogan is one people, one heart. United we stand. That means identity politics, regionalism, all these forms, even though Eritrea is a state of 9 nationalities, Isaias was not ready to recognize. Isaias also introduced this model, the Sawa model, as a nation building instrument. You know, in Eritrea there are two generations, the Yikalo and Warsa generation. Warsa is the young generation, the post-1991 generation. It was considered that it is better to build the nation in Sawa by integrating the Yikalo and Warsa generation. Then he trained 7 rounds. After 7 years, he began to have a conflictual relationship with its neighbors. It started in Sudan in 1995, I think 1996 in Yemen, and then Djibouti. Finally, in 1998, it was the war declared by Eritrea against Ethiopia. And then in 1998, Isaias Afwerki declared the war against invaded Badme. Even the currency was also an issue. Naqfa was an issue that Isaias Afwerki proposed that Naqfa and the birr should be exchanged equally. But there are also oppositions on the name of itself. You know, Naqfa is, for Eritrean, it was a symbol of determination, heroism, victory, and so on. But at the time, it was considered that Amhara, who controlled the bureaucracy, they were defeated by the Derg regime. So when they seize of Naqfa, it will be an insult to them. So the name itself, and at the same time, the economic power of Naqfa, because Isaias Afwerki requested that Naqfa and Birr should be exchanged equally. But the economic base of Eritrea and Ethiopia is totally different, and that leads to, we can consider as a pretext. So finally, the war was declared. But the war in 1998 was, totally reversed Isaias Afwerki's ambition. It was a total humiliation for Isaias Afwerki and his ambition in the Horn of Africa. It was defeated. At the beginning, Isaias Afwerki was so arrogant, rejecting all types of mediations. Even the sun will never rise in the east. He claimed that. EPLF was stating that our relation with EPLF, it was tactical, not strategical. Strategically, EPLF is undemocratic. EPLF will lead the Eritrean liberation struggle until Eritrea become an independent state. After that, the Eritreans should search a new democratic political party. Eritrea was politically defeated, militarily defeated, and Isaias Afwerki requested the African Union and the Americans that to challenge PLF not to enter to Asmara, and he was saved. And then after that they signed the Algiers Agreement. The Algiers Agreement was an agreement that reflects the military victory of TPLF and EPRDF and the humiliation of Isaias Afwerki. And then according to the Algiers Agreement, the border conflict will be decided by the international border commission, and there is a commission for that inquires who begins the war, who began the war. So his ambition was deterred, and Meles was successful in deterring, as well as Isaias Afwerki from international politics. And Isaias Afwerki followed the policy of isolation from political engagement in international politics. His foreign policy was isolation, and his regional policy was destabilizing Lahore. So for 20 years, he recruited all Ethiopian opposition forces, not only Ethiopian but also the Somali opposition forces, any opposition force in the Horn of Africa that opposes the TPLF-EPRDF government, and he trained in Eritrea for 20 years. The Aider incident was simply, it was a continuation of targeting the non-military establishments there. Even he targeted the Addis Pharmacy in Adigrat and other non-military bases. The reason was that I will strike all military and non-military bases. These are simply the property of my enemy, that is PLF. That's why it was targeting the students in a school. But it was, for Isaias Afwerki, it is not a big deal to deal with international laws and humanitarian or moral values.
In 1994, Eritrea would start to require national service of its youth. Conscripts were militarily trained, but then demobilized after 18 months. Later, after the end of the war in 2001, the Eritrean regime would introduce Warsa Yika'alo development campaign and declare that all high school students would complete their education in Warsa Yika'alo Secondary and Vocational Training Center in Sawa Military Training Camp, located in an isolated area in the region of Gashbarka. Warsa Yika'alo development campaign also made national services an indefinite way of life in Eritrea. Eritrean youth were destined to live a life of indefinite military service without any pay or benefits. More so, Sawa Military Training Camp would literally turn into a living nightmare for many Eritrean youth that were exploited and harassed by authorities that exercised unchecked authority. Sexual exploitation of female recruits is common, and those that refuse face harsh punishment by their superiors.
They took us to Sawa, but after 2 days in Sawa, they were gathering up women from everywhere. they took us to farms. So I went to 3 or 4 different farms, just working the fields. We would plant, weed, do a bit of everything. And throughout our work, our guards would make deals with other generals who had farms nearby. So they would take us there, do the work, and take the money, I guess. Throughout our stay in these different farms, there were many women who were either threatened or were asked for sexual favors in exchange for cell phones, a phone call, in exchange for water, in exchange for pads, menstrual pads, for anything. Some were desperate. All were desperate.
These conditions would force an exodus of youth from Eritrea. The country would become the second largest producer of refugees to Europe, falling behind only Syria, a country embroiled in one of the deadliest conflicts in the world.
An estimated 5,000 people leave Eritrea every month, and almost as many men, women, and children left that country last year as fled Syria. It is a human exodus that is all the more staggering when you consider that this is a country of just 6 million people and one that is not presently at war.
They forced us to discontinue our education and pulled us into national service. They told us it was our national obligation. We were made part of the military and turned into slaves. We have to do everything they tell us. At a certain point, it becomes unbearable for most of the recruiters and they flee Eritrea.
We need to know, has it now definitely stopped the indefinite usage of people in national service?
There has never been indefinite usage of people in national service.
The UN says completely contrary.
Well, you just brought the UN report on your clip that I saw. The UN report, if you ask people who live in Eritrea, including European Union ambassadors, will tell you that this is a distorted picture of the reality.
It's wrong to think that this country is missing out because these people have left. They cannot in any way affect our work. Some may think they've weakened us, but really, having people like that on your team is burdensome.
Yeah, after 2001, Eritrea follows a different track. You know, in 2001, Isaias Afwerki eliminated all political forces, or the G15, closed all the medias, and then he introduces the national service. And in the national service, all Eritreans from age of 18 up to 40 are forced to be soldiers of the Eritrea. They were mobilized. Their education after the 10th grade, 11th grade, they should enroll into Sawa, and they should learn politics, the politics of hate against Tigrai and Ethiopia, the Wayane, the Jandamalil syndrome, and then military training. The Eritreans are totally mobilized into a battalion state, into a military state, militarized society. There are no organized national and domestic foreign policy and domestic policies. Rather, Isaias interviews are considered as a policy of the state. So the economic base is simply, even trafficking is the economic base of the generals, selling the organs of the Eritreans. He changed his economic base into army soldiers and mafia economic engagements, so that the army soldiers is one of the reasons.
If you see Isaias, he was running the state like a one-man show, kind of a monologue of political discourse. There is no constitution in Eritrea. There is no functional, or there is no parliament after all. Multi-partyism is prohibited. There is only a single party run by himself. So this guy, Isaias Afwerki, runs undemocratic politics.
In 2019, the world was told of a peace deal between Ethiopia and Eritrea, the details of which are yet to come to light. But leaders of the two countries would make multiple public visits, and after decades of a no war, no peace situation, there was some resemblance of hope that Eritreans would find the peace and stability they had long wished for so many decades. Dreams were shattered just a year later, when the Ethiopian government, along with Eritrea, declared war on Tigray. forcing thousands of conscripted youth in Eritrea into a war that promised to make living conditions in Eritrea even more difficult.